to see everyone or see those of you who are on camera, and I see names that I recognize, so that's always good. Well, we have a treat for you tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michelle Leet. I'm the first vice president and chair of the Freedom Fund Fundraising Committee. Again, I want to thank you for joining us tonight for our Remember Our Roots history lesson. It will be a treat, like I said. Before I turn it over to President Camlin, though, I do want to introduce, talk about just take a minute to talk about the donations to the branch and thank those of you who donated to us during this virtual fundraiser and in the past. We have held virtual fundraisers for the past 3 years now and really appreciate the support from our members and partner organizations, especially during the early days and months of COVID. We sometimes forget that nonprofits require funding in order to do the good work that they do. There is certainly a cost to operate, especially in a county that requires just a little bit more than average to sustain oneself. So we've kept our membership dues low for many years, and therefore we depend on your donations to ensure we can do the important advocacy and racial justice work, as well as give back to the community. We are very proud that during these last few years, we have given thousands in scholarships to youth and to our nonprofit partners who are doing the great work to combat homelessness and food insecurity, domestic violence, and so much more. We like to say freedom isn't free, and therefore sincerely appreciate your donations, small and large. We want you to please consider giving where you can. We have about a week left in this virtual fundraiser and still a bit away from our fundraising goal. But we have no doubt that we will come through as we have in the last few years, and we will either get near or reach our goal. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my hardworking Freedom Fund Committee. I see some of them on, Diana Rose, Nira Dada, Monique Norwood, Rachel Luckenbaugh, and Erica Scott. They are always busy planning and organizing, and this event and the virtual fundraisers wouldn't be possible without their work. Thanks again for supporting the branch, and I'll now turn it over to President Camlin, who will introduce our beloved Ed Henderson.
Thank you so much, VP Leet. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. And as Michelle said, we're in for a wonderful treat hearing from Edwin Henderson. So we'd like to take this opportunity to introduce you to Edwin Henderson. I'm quite sure many of you know who he is, but I would be remiss without giving a brief introduction. I'll be very quick because I know I would much rather hear Ed speak than myself. So he's an active member of the Fairfax County NAACP, a renowned historian, and the founder of the Tinner Hill Heritage Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization to preserve early civil rights era and African-American history in Northern Virginia. Following the footsteps of many change makers, including his grandfather, Dr. Edwin Henderson, Mr. Henderson is a change maker himself through effecting social change by researching and preserving African-American history and being involved in telling the narratives of the past accurately and making sure it's accurately portrayed and rightfully placed in the halls of American history. So with that, I would like to turn the microphone over to Mr. Edwin Henderson. Thank you for being with us here today, and thank you for joining us on this wonderful summer evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I'd like to thank everyone that's tuning in to take a break up from your summer vacations. August is always so busy with summer vacations. I'm really surprised to see we have as many people as we do, but I'm also thankful for that as well. I'd like to first start out by saying that this branch, the Fairfax County branch, I think prides itself on, first of all, being the first and the oldest rural branch in the country, because 6 years after the formation of the NAACP, a group of African Americans sought to have a branch here in Fairfax County, particularly Falls Church, as it was the first branch that was chartered in 1918 was the Falls Church and Vicinity branch, but the people of the branch never liked that name because they always felt that they represented the entire county. And they also fought very hard to spread the movement throughout Northern Virginia after starting the branch here, starting one in Leesburg, starting one in Arlington and in Alexandria. There was an article in the Washington Bee that said that, they had a recurring column on, it was called Gleaming Falls Church. And one of the articles that came out said that we have initiated 450 people to our movement. And a number of these can be found if you go to the Tennehill website, www.tennehill.org, and there's a link to a portal that was established through a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Partnership and Scholarship Grant. And with that money, we were able to get George Mason University and the African and African American History Department to create a website entitled 100 Years Black Falls Church. But it's much deeper than that. The other thing I'd like to point out is that at the 65th, in 1965, the branch was celebrating 50 years. And that's because in 1915, the branch, let me go ahead and just start. In 1915, the town of Falls Church had proposed an ordinance that would have created 4 segregated districts in the town, the smallest of which was set aside for African Americans or colored only. And it meant that if your house, your property was in a part of the town that was designated or was in one of these districts that was for whites only, then you as a African American would have to sell your property to a white person and move to the part of town that was designated for color only. This was established by a 1912 state bill that said municipalities could do such a thing. Well, when that happened, the gentleman you see on my right, I guess, that's my grandfather, E.B. Henderson, called a meeting at the home of Joseph Tenner on Tenner Hill. And they met with 7 other gentlemen. Sometimes they were called the Council of 9, but they established themselves as the Colored Citizens Protective League. And they established themselves to fight against this ordinance, this unjust ordinance that would have dispossessed them of their property in Falls Church. So they started a writing letter campaign, and they wrote to all of the, they met at the home of Joseph Tenner. I would say that. They started a writing campaign. They wrote letters to all of the town council, all of the businesses, and all of the churches to see where these entities, these institutions in the town, where they stood on the issue of this ordinance. And secondly, they decided that they would write a letter to W.E.B. Du Bois, asking to form a branch here in Falls Church. E.B. Henderson and his wife, Mary Ellen Henderson, were members already of the Washington, D.C. branch of the NAACP. And that's because Mary Ellen was a member of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. And her pastor was a gentleman named Francis Grimke. And Francis Grimke's brother, Archibald Grimke, was the founder and the president of the DC branch of the NAACP, which was established in 1912. And being that they were both teachers, well, being that E.B. and Mary Ellen were both teachers in the DC colored school system, they were constantly in Washington and part of the social circle there, which was part of the NAACP. Back to the topic here. The letter that was written to W.B. Du Bois, which we were able to get by going to the Library of Congress, where there's a file, all of the records of the NAACP are housed there. And the letter, asked to form a branch here in Falls Church. The letter that came back, mind you, said that there are no rule branches. And that was because you needed 50 people to sign up to form a branch, to form a charter. And in small rural communities, of which Falls Church in Fairfax County was in 1915, you couldn't find, you might not be able to find 50 people or 50 people that were willing to put their lives or their livelihoods on the line in order to stand up to injustice. It could mean your life. It could mean your livelihood. It could mean intimidation or worse. And so the letter that came back also mentioned that even though there are no rule branches, that the NAACP will provide your committee with resources to fight this injustice. And so this the Colored Citizens Protective League, they hired 2 lawyers from Washington, D.C., who wrote up a brief on how what the town was trying to do was unconstitutional. There's a booklet that outlines this history. I was telling you before, when in 1965, the branch was celebrating its 50th anniversary. And that's because they include the 3 years that they were the Colored Citizens Protective League before they actually received the charter as the Falls Church and Vicinity NAACP. This history is in a booklet that it says by Dr. E.B. Henderson, as told, oh, you can't see it, by Edith Hussey. Okay. And you can find this at most libraries, but they're as rare as hen's teeth. But that's where the history is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to use a PowerPoint to follow along as talking points, if that's okay. Let's see.
Is there anything? Oh, okay, got it.
Okay, can we see that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, the gentleman on the right, the much larger picture, that's the picture of Joseph Tenner. He was a stonemason, but he was also known to be a pillar of the community here in Falls Church, and was known for his speaking ability and his oration. Let's see, how do we move forward? Okay. After the emancipation, there was in Falls Church, this gentleman here is Frederick Forrest Foote Jr. And when Falls Church became a town in 1875, he was elected first as the town constable. And then in 1880, he was elected to the town council. Now, Falls Church, there was a community of African Americans that lived along Annandale Road that lived within the city limits of Falls Church. And they were able to elect this gentleman who was a Republican. Now, mind you, this isn't the Republican Party of today. This was the party of Lincoln, okay? And after the emancipation, I hate to say slavery or Civil War, I'm saying the emancipation, he was, African Americans could vote. And here in Falls Church, they had a block of Republican votes, Black voters, mind you, Black men only, unfortunately. And women wouldn't be allowed to vote, unfortunately, until 1920. But the Black men voted this man into office. And Fred Foote was known because he was a cobbler, but he owned the largest grocery store in the vicinity. And therefore, not only Blacks, but whites as well bought their groceries at his store. So he was a known entity. This document here is something I found in the attic in a box. And this is the document which makes him elected to the town council in 1880. This is an official document. Also here in the town of Falls Church, this is a Hopkins map. The Hopkins brothers were surveyors, and they made surveys of many of the small towns like Fairfax, city of Fairfax, and Alexandria and other places. But where you see the center, no, wait a minute, let's go back. How do we go back? Right here is the old Falls Church. Now back then, the Falls Church was considered the center of town, and therefore everything else emanated from that. But there was a woman named Harriet Bryce who bought a piece of property right next to the Falls Church, and she should always say, I bought a piece of property in Falls Church in the center of town next to the Falls Church. And that her home actually stood there until around 1950. I have aerial photographs of it. But here it says George Bryce. It doesn't say Harriet Bryce. George was her husband. And that's how things were, I guess, back then. But George owned this piece, and this piece. This woman, Harriet Foote Turner, was an aunt of Fred Foote Jr. And his father, Fred Foote Sr., was her brother, who owned most of what's Seven Corners. Now, Fred Foote's store was right on Leesburg Pike, right here, next to the Falls Church. I told you about the Colored Citizens Protective League, or rather the CCPL. And these are the handwritten minutes from the first meeting. The first meeting was at the home of Joseph Tenner. And Mr. Tenner called the meeting into session. They voted officers. Among those present were Tenner, Joseph Tenner, Melvin Tenner, Summerall, Henderson, Reverend Powell, Reverend Colbert, and there were 9. I'm not sure how many were there. Even though Edwin Henderson called the meeting, he had this thing where he did not want to be the person up front. He wanted to handle, being a prolific writer that he was, he decided that he wanted to be the secretary. Now, not a lot of people today want to join or become a secretary, but he saw that being the secretary meant that he would be able to use his skill as a writer to affect change. And that's what he did. Okay, this is one of the letters that went out to the town council. Okay, this letter says the mayor and council, town of Falls Church. Okay. This protest of the members and officers of the Colored Citizens Protective League, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church of Falls Church, respectfully sets forth that they have learned an ordinance is on its passage in your council. For the purposes of the, you can probably see this better than I can. They wanted to know where they stood on the issue of the ordinance and how they felt about dispossessing Black people of their land. Okay, here's another letter. This letter basically put out to the citizens that why would you want to change things? We've worked side by side. We've lived in harmony for these many years. So why would you want to change things in the way that you're proposing? Well, the town council, after hearing what the lawyers that the Colored Citizens Protective League had created their brief, the town council decided that they would not vote on the matter, but rather they would put the matter to the citizens. And this flyer here was another thing I found in that box in the attic that talks about, well, there's 2 things in this election. Okay, and halfway down, it says that first, they're going to vote on segregation of the races within the town, yes and no. And second, changes of charter so as to give the council authority to increase the maximum rate of taxation on the town, 20 cents on $100. Okay. The town being majority, and the council actually too, being majority Democrat, they voted in favor of the ordinance. But once that was done, the Colored Citizens Protective League sued the town in Fairfax County Circuit Court. This prohibited them from enforcing the ordinance. But secondly, it also brought the courts into the matter. They invited the judge to come out and look at the 4 districts that had been created by the ordinance. But the judge decided that he would not rule on the case because there was a similar case coming before the Supreme Court the following year in 1917. This case was Warley, W-A-R-L-E-Y, versus Buchanan. And I'm talking about the United States Supreme Court, mind you, okay? That court case was argued before by the president of the NAACP, a gentleman named Moorfield Story, who was a white lawyer from Boston. Now, there's a lot of people that associate the NAACP with being purely an African-American organization. But if you know your history, you'll understand that after the 1908 race riot in Lincoln, Illinois, in Springfield, Illinois, the home of Lincoln, there were progressive whites and Jews that created the NAACP. They invited W.E.B. Du Bois of the Niagara movement, as well as Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells. And those were the people who actually made up the NAACP in its beginning. But Moorfield Story was the president of the organization for the first 18 years until Walter White took over in the mid to late 1920s. The letter that went to W.E.B. Du Bois is here. And it's signed by the secretary of the committee, E.B. Henderson. Might I say, before I get to this here, let me say that the ruling in the United States Supreme Court case of Warley versus Buchanan ruled that such an ordinance was unconstitutional. And this meant that the town of Falls Church would not be able to enforce the ordinance which they had hoped to. However, it was on the books and it remained on the books till 1998, when the mayor of Falls Church at the time, Tenor Hill Heritage Foundation was established in 1997. And the mayor of Falls Church, David Snyder, took it off the books and at the behest of the Tenor Hill Heritage Foundation. They labored a number of years. 1997, the very next year, the NAACP changed their charter so that smaller organizations, other than the 50 that were necessary to create a branch, would be able to do so. This led the way for many rural communities, including county branches, to be established. But the Falls Church branch was established as the Falls Church and Vicinity NAACP. This is what E.B. Henderson looked like in the early 19-teens. Okay, this is E.B. Henderson, secretary of the CCPL and the NAACP. And this is Joseph Tenor, the president of both the Colored Citizens Protective League and then subsequently the Fairfax NAACP. Now, there were many people that came through this town assisting African Americans in their efforts. Among them, the field coordinator for the NAACP was a gentleman by the name of James Weldon Johnson. And here you see this program for Labor Day, September 6, 1920, with James Weldon Johnson giving the address, and then dinner, and then another address by Mr. Chandler Owen, and editor, the Messenger magazine. The Messenger magazine, of course, was the magazine of a gentleman named A. Philip Randolph, who at one time held national office in the NAACP, but he's better known as a labor leader and the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was an African-American organization that represented the porters, who were all African-American, on the trains that traveled throughout the country. This is before airplanes, the advent of airplanes. Okay. Here's another document of a mass meeting, and this is in 1921. This mass meeting was because of the push by certain organizations and entities to create a Robert E. Lee highway, a national highway, mind you, that would go through Falls Church and much of Fairfax County, but also would extend from one coast to the other. And in Falls Church, I don't know how, but I came across this engineering map of it being cut. And right here, you see, this is E.B. Henderson. And over on the other side, that's E.B. Henderson's land there. Here is Cato Adams on this side, on the north side, and as well on the south side, which basically shows you that in order to cut the road, they decided to come, which was typical back in those days, smack dab through the African-American community. And when I first saw this map, I didn't know what it was, but I kept it because I'm a pack rat, much like my grandparents were as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a lot of this stuff, maybe. But eventually, looking at the map, I recognized what this was. And this is something that I like to show people. Okay. Also in the schools, one of the biggest advocacies of the NAACP was education. Education for our African-American children. In the late 40s, Mary Ellen Henderson, along with Ollie Tenner and several others, did a study of the allocation of funds in Fairfax County. Now, you know, the Plessy versus Ferguson meant supposedly that things were separate but equal. But if you look at the funding, there's no way that things could be equal. If you look at this, the white schools were all brick or stone, except 4. They have running water, janitorial service, inside toilets, and central heating. And the children ride in heated buses. The Negro schools, 1 to 3 room wooden buildings all have outside pit toilets for teachers and children, no running water, all stoves in the rooms. In other words, potbelly stove in the middle of the room. No janitorial services. The teachers, the Black teachers, were responsible for janitorial services. The teachers would haul water, and they would make the fires inside of the potbelly stove in the middle of the room. And on top of all that, they were paid less than the white teachers. 3 schools had no water on the premises. Some children walked 4 to 6 miles to school. Buses are old and rickety and are not heated. In other words, everything that, it didn't cost anything for the African-American schools, because the African-American schools got whatever was passed down after the white schools had gotten new things. And that included textbooks as well. And so the textbooks were the old textbooks that were cast off from the white schools. And many of the white students knew that these would be going to Black schools. So many of them wrote racial epitaphs in the books or tore out vital pages of information so that African Americans would get a subpar resource to be educated by. Now, if you look at it under here, they took the 1935, I thought it was 38, school budget. And if you look at this, the white schools, look at the last line there, received 97.4% of each dollar that was allocated to teach in the schools, the public schools of Fairfax County. Whereas the colored schools received 2.6% out of every dollar, okay? So separate but equal, separate for sure, equal, no, okay? And after this study was done, a biracial or multicultural, multiracial committee was created to help bring about change in Fairfax County. Now, when the schools were, after Brown versus Board of Education, here in Virginia, there were a number of lawyers. This is Edwin Henderson. Okay. There were several lawyers. Well, the state of Virginia had 7 attorneys that were working to combat Harry Byrd, the Harry Byrd machine, that had vowed massive resistance against desegregation in Virginia. But those 7 lawyers were such a headache for Harry Byrd, and that, along with the federal courts, they helped to bring about change. In 1960, let me stop sharing. Okay. In 1960, well, 1959 actually, the Fairfax County had proposed a plan to desegregate, whereas 1 grade per year would be integrated until all K through 12 grades would be integrated. Well, the federal courts in 1959, they said, no, that's not good enough. And they put in place a facility to create pupil placement of Black students in the white public schools. The first year, the court case, there were 30 some applicants. to go to white schools. And after some backlash, the courts decided that that would be allowed. The next year, and that would be, okay, the first year was 60, 61. 61, 62, there were 100 African-American students that attended white schools. The following year, there were 212. So that's 62, 63. In the following year, 63, 64, there were 400. And this snowballed until finally in 64, 65, the county decided that they would integrate their schools. Now, mind you, Arlington County integrated in 1961. Falls Church City also integrated in 1960, 61. And so you had other pockets. The DC schools, they integrated in 1954. They were federal territory. So basically they had to follow the federal rule. And they didn't have, they didn't have home rule then, but they did have the federal government who was really running the District of Columbia at the time, along with citizen associations in various communities around the city. And then in 1970, or late 60s, I think, that's when Walter Washington became the first mayor of Washington, D.C. There is a, let's see if I can find another PowerPoint, because I'd like to also talk about the advent of, or should I say the challenges of African-American land ownership in Fairfax County. You see, here in Northern Virginia, there were a number of, after or during the Civil War, African Americans were considered contraband because of an incident that happened at Fort Comfort, where 3 enslaved gentlemen rowed a boat over to Fortress Monroe. And Benjamin Butler, who was the commander of the fort at the time, even though this was during the Civil War, it was federal property. And after they rowed their boat over and they asked for asylum. And the very next day, the owners of these 3 gentlemen came over and said, you know, according to the the Fugitive Slave Act, you have to give us our property back. Benjamin Butler, being the imaginative person that he was, said, well, basically, I don't have to do anything because this is federal property. And that's a law in the United States of America. And since you all are the Confederate States of America, that rule doesn't apply. These are contrabands of war. And that's how African Americans came to be called, contraband. It's a very derogatory term in most cases, but this is what happened. Here in Northern Virginia, there were several contraband camps. One was on Halls Hill. There were 2 in McLean. There was Camp Jackson and Camp McVeigh. There was Camp Rucker. There was another camp in Alexandria. And then, of course, there was Camp Barker in Washington, D.C. But because of the disease and things that transpired there, they built on the grounds of the Robert E. Lee estate, Freedman's Village. Okay. And generally, most of these contraband camps became Black settlements. But also there are a number of African Americans who, escaping slavery, found their way to the Union lines and then came to Washington, D.C. or the area, and helped to populate not only Northern Virginia, but Washington, D.C. in large part. Now here in Fairfax County, out of 13,000 population in the 1860 census, mind you, 1,700 were free Blacks. And many of them, their former enslavers, or I don't know of a better way to put that. When they freed them, they gave them land. Some of these go back to Robert Carter III, who was the grandson of Robert Carter, or as they called him, King Carter, who was the land agent for Lord Fairfax. And he freed over 4,000 enslaved people, mind you. And he gave them land. Now, a lot of this land was next to white landowners, and they weren't none too happy about being neighbors with these newly freed African Americans, because they felt that they were supreme, or whatever they felt, you know. But be that as it may, white is not supreme. And these people owned land. There was two brothers out in Centerville. One of them owned 242 acres, and another one owned over 150. So some of these African Americans owned significant acres of land. Many of you have probably heard of Gum Springs and West Ford, who received his freedom and land from Bushrod, Washington. But really what happened is that Bushrod gave him land that was more like wetlands. And he sold that property and then bought Gum Springs. But as we move on, after the emancipation, there were many people that helped African Americans to purchase land. Now, here in Falls Church, that person was Colonel John Crocker. And what he would do is he would buy land and then he would resell it to African Americans at reasonable rates, supposedly. In Vienna, there was a gentleman named Orrin Hine. Orrin Hine, oh, and there's a guy named Salisbury too, Major or Colonel Salisbury. And Orrin Hine was an agent for the Freedmen's Bureau. And sometimes he would have to intervene to protect Blacks from whites that would take advantage of them. I have one letter that there was a gentleman that was owed money by a white man, and he wrote him a letter and told him that he better pay up. But he was another person. And a number of these people they might have been called that very derogatory name called carpetbaggers, in other words, Northerners who came south and were helpful to African Americans. However, there were many ways that legal ways that a lot of this land was recaptured by whites or the government even. One scheme was actually started after the formation of the Fairfax County Zoning Department during the pardon my 6-year-old, during the Depression. My grandfather, he owned the 86-acre farm, which is now National Memorial Cemetery. And when they changed the zoning and raised the taxes, he decided that he'd have to sell, and he sold it to the cemetery people. This happened to a number of people throughout Fairfax County in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Fred Foote, who owned Seven Corners, for instance, was also a relative, an ancestor of mine. In 1952, his family was forced to sell their 40 acres. But even before that, they had run US 50 through their property and took that land by eminent domain. Then there was a water line. They took some more land by eminent domain. And they changed from farm to residential to commercial. Commercial property had the highest taxation. And so in 1952, a Fairfax County Circuit Court judge listened to a suit where 3 of the members of the Foote family sued the other 17 to break the covenant on the deed and to sell the property. Now, they were represented by lawyers from developers. And the judge ruled that the land was to be sold. And he set a price of $400,000 for the full parcel. And he assigned 2 commissioners to accept bids. Now, Fairfax County was known as a bedroom community for Washington, D.C. And this goes back all the way to the late 1800s when they developed the trolley system, went into Washington, D.C. and took people in and out every day. But what happened is that these commissioners were accepting bribes. And in 1966, there were federal racketeering charges brought against 5 of the Fairfax County Board of Commissioners for accepting bribes from developers. There were 4 developers named, and there were 5 county supervisors. Also on the indictment was a land use attorney from Falls Church City named well, let's just leave it at that. And there were the director and the assistant director of planning for the county. This was in 1966. Many of the, and there was one state senator who all of a sudden became so sick that he couldn't stand trial. That's funny. In this case, 2 of the county commissioners went to jail, and the other 3 county commissioners were responsible for turning state's evidence against them. And all 4 of the developers went to jail. But this was indicative of how African Americans were being taken advantage of in the county through legal means, mind you. Well, not actually legal means. And so that was a dark spot on the county, but it's what was happening. And, you know, to some extent, it may still happen today, probably does. But this was a case of them getting their hand caught in the cookie jar. Fairfax County has quite a history of not only well, let me change. I'd like to go back to this document here, because recently the Fairfax NAACP received an award for being one of the best county branches, or the best branches in the country. But also, let's see, in 1918, okay, it became a charter was given to the Falls Church and Vicinity NAACP. In 1942 or 43, the county received a charter as a county branch. And in 1947, the National Convention of the NAACP was held over in the district in Washington, D.C. And the Fairfax County branch was cited as the best county branch in the nation. The president at the time was a man named Milton Shepard. And was accorded a seal of honor at the Lincoln Memorial meeting. Okay. I'm basically running out of things to say. So let me entertain any questions that people may have at this time.
And I have
Question.
copious notes, but I'm going to open it up for questions. I have some questions in my notes, but I'll get back to them. Does anyone have questions they want to present to Mr. Henderson?
I would like to ask Mr. Henderson about a former neighbor of mine. His name was William Alexander West.
Yes.
And yes, and he lived from 1874 to 1978. And according to the information I have, that he helped to organize the Fairfax County branch NAACP in 1944. And he served as the local chapter secretary for about 26 years. He was honored in 1962 by the NAACP with lifetime membership for his work. And I just wanted to know if you were familiar with him.
I'm familiar with William West and his father Daniel as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And William West also, he was a community organizer, much like
yes, he was.
like Obama, a community organizer. But he also started an organization called the Colored
Fair
Fair
Association.
Association.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And the Fair Association was basically in the grounds near Shrevwood
Mm-hmm.
Elementary School.
Okay.
And that was part of the land that was also, they were taxed out of it during the Depression as well.
I see.
And during the
Yes.
during the Depression, I saw that they had disincorporated.
Correct.
Okay.
And the information I have says that organization you just referred to
Yes.
Was organized in 1908 and it flourished until the Depression in 1930.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very, and another thing, in what was it? The 225th anniversary of Fairfax County, no, 250th anniversary of Fairfax County, the county government put out a calendar. And in that calendar, they demarcated honorably how two dates, and that was the day that E.B. Henderson died and the day that William West died.
Really?
Now, to me, that's a backhanded compliment, but I think they did that because they were so happy because they gave them so much hell when they were little.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That is it. And you mentioned Orrin Hine and Captain
Yes.
Salisbury, and they were people who sold land to Black residents in Vienna. Orrin Hine, who became the first mayor of Vienna back in 1867, he sold property to First Baptist Church of Vienna. And William Lewis's father and grandfather were both a part of the trustees during that time, so they were involved in that.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Mr. Henderson, we have a couple folks with raised hands. I think I saw Stephen Spitz's hand first, and then Mary Payton.
Okay,
Yeah,
Stephen.
hey Ed, how you doing?
All right.
I have a question that with all your land records and the attempts right now, pending legislation by Sheila Jackson Lee and Barbara Lee on reparations, whether or not the case can be made that land, at least some of the land that you were talking about around Seven Corners and other places in Fairfax County and in Virginia, it can be established that that land was discriminatorily taken from the original owners, and as reparations, the government would need to restore land ownership to those people or their heirs. Whether or not you think a case can be made.
You know, I'm not a lawyer like yourself. You are a lawyer. Whether a case can be made is something that will have to be determined by people a little bit more in tune with the legal system than myself.
No, I'm talking about a legal case. I'm talking about a political case for reparations. In other words, restorative justice. Reparations has a history worldwide, including in this country, with respect to Japanese Americans, for example, who were contributing during World War II, etc. It's just a matter of restorative justice. And I'm not talking about litigation. I'm talking about that Congress would do this. But you'd have to have a basis for, saying that the land was unjustly seized.
Yeah, and I think that that's the part that's problematic. I mean, even in the land that was taken by eminent domain from my family, they were given something, not market value, but maybe tax assessed value for the land. So they were compensated. They weren't just actually dispossessed. Now, if that had happened under the ordinance that had been here in Falls Church, I could see where a restorative justice could be made. But, I am well in favor of some form of reparations for African Americans, because I think that it's a part of what we need in this country in order to put the history of slavery behind us. I know that my ancestors, or a branch of my ancestors, were owned by the Mordecai Fitzhugh plantation. I know that my great grandmother was sold down south after Mordecai Fitzhugh died, and but she, after the Battle of Vicksburg, ended up at a plantation in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And generally speaking, the average life of those that were sold down south was 7 years and never seen again. People were never seen again. Not only was there injustice or brutality, but there was outright brutality against these people, sadistic brutality. And so at somewhere, either in this world or in the cosmos, justice needs to be made. And a simple apology, in my opinion, is not enough. We can start with truth and reconciliation, but I think it needs to go way further than that. And even though my family hasn't done too bad, I think that the creation, there was a creation of an underclass here in America. And I think that those people, more than anyone, need to have some restorative justice. And how it's to be done, or how it's to be distributed, mind you, I think that's the $64 million question.
I think Mary, you
Yeah,
have your hand
I
raised?
do.
Okay.
I do. Yeah, this is Mary Payton. I'm the chair of the Housing Committee at NAACP. And we're working with some other folks on trying to map out kind of the history of segregation in Fairfax County. And I'm wondering if you know any maps that would show during different eras Black property ownership.
No, but I do know where the Black communities were, and there's an excellent map. And if you wait just a minute, I'll go get it for you.
Right.
I love that answer. I don't know, but wait a minute. I have one right behind me.
Walked right through the screen. He's going to bring it up.
Right, I was gonna say, as he disappears
Right.
behind the screen,
You can ask for more.
here he comes.
There was a map that was first produced in 1999. The African American landowners, churches, schools, and businesses, Fairfax County, 1860 to 1900. And it was produced by Calabri, Don Hankinson, Franconia Museum, with the support of Black Women United for Action. And the text was created by Guinevere Scott Jones. And the photo editor was James Powell. This edition that I have here is from 2009. They didn't do a whole lot of upgrades to it, but what they did was they put together a map and they showed where the African American communities were, but also where all the schools were, where all the churches were. Because generally, if you had a church and you had a school, a lot of times the churches were doing the schooling as well. But before the early 1900s, each of the county districts was in charge of building and managing of the schools. And so you have Mount Vernon District, Lee District, Providence District, Falls Church area, Mason District, Drainsville, Huntersville. Okay, but it also lists a number of the largest landowners in these areas. The map doesn't show the plats, but it does show the areas in the county where Black communities existed. And so that might be of some help, but I think you have to look at deeds, and a lot of times you really don't know, because a lot of times, they don't indicate if the person is African American or not. A lot of the census records in conjunction with that can also, if you cross-reference them, help you.
Did you show the cover?
Jaspers, Gaskins, throughout the county, which I recognize from the 1860 census. And then you had a lot of new people that came in, you know, an influx of people that came in after the emancipation. You know, in the area of Herndon, which they really, they say they don't really know where it is, was Grovetown or Cooktown. Okay. And then you had other areas such as Audrick's Corner. Audrick's Corner was an area right off of Tyson's Corner. And many of the places where churches were and school, if you had a church and a school, the chance, if there was a black church and a black school, chances are there was a black community there as well.
Okay.
I noticed right off of the campus of George Mason, there's a historic, a Virginia historic marker that designates a Rosenwald school. That means that there was a African-American population in that area. There
Okay.
was a gentleman I knew who actually said he used to play baseball on the campus before it was the college. And you had black families on either side, on Roberts Road and on Chainbridge Road. You have the Calvary Baptist Church there. I think it's a Baptist church, you know. But all of that area has basically been bought up, and townhouses and other housing has been in its place now. So the recognition of where African-American communities were has been totally erased by gentrification, redevelopment, and a lot of that history has been lost. That's why this map that I'm talking about is so important. I hope that helps. I don't think I was much help to you, but that's the best I can do.
No, I think that's good. I may follow up with you on that.
Okay.
See where I can get that map. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Let me see if there's something in the chat. Okay, so Reverend Linda asked, have you heard about the graves of the 91 enslaved that were discovered at Bull Run Regional Park?
At where, Bull Run?
Yes.
No.
So they were, I'm sorry, this is Reverend Linda. They were 91 enslaved that were manumitted by Robert Carter III. So that was recently discovered this spring, and we dedicated the branch, and with the NAACP Youth Council dedicated and commemorated the site. The site also includes a church that was built by Robert Carter III, where enslaved and free could worship together. And it was the only one in Virginia where that was true.
Well, Robert Carter III, he basically, over a 12-year period, freed thousands of slaves. His father owned several thousand, owned 110,000 acres. I mean, surely, I mean, in giving land away for Lord Fairfax, he feathered his nest a little bit as well. And, but Mary Lipsey with the Fairfax History Commission and Maddie, what's her name? Maddie, can anybody help me here?
I think it's Maddie McCoy, Ed.
Maddie McCoy, yes. They've done yeoman's work on building a database of graveyards and I think it's a slave database or a freeman's database. They've done a great job in preserving that history. There's also another graveyard for soldiers near the Fairfax Hospital in an area that was called Pine Ridge. And another African-American graveyard for soldiers on Lee Jackson Highway in the city of Fairfax, near, well, there's a crossroads where
Germantown
29
Road.
and 50 come together.
Yeah, at Germantown Road.
Germantown
Germantown.
Road, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But this new graveyard, what is it called? The
It's
one
that Bull Run Regional Park.
Bull Run
I-
Regional Park?
Yes, I'd be happy to arrange a tour for you out there if you'd like to go out and see it.
Okay, I like that. Okay. So
Okay.
let's arrange a tour.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we close things out?
I got one quick one.
Oh, go ahead.
The comparison you showed of the white and black schools, I didn't get the date of that. And I'd be interested in how that came to be prepared if you have time.
Well, my grandmother, Mary Ellen Henderson, or Nellie Henderson, as she was customarily called, Miss Nellie. She was the principal of the Falls Church Colored School. And she and Ollie Tenner would go before the school board. They went before the school board for the better part of 20 years, asking for better facilities and better materials and supplies, all of which were customarily denied. They would even raise money and give it to the school and then ask for better facilities. Well, they got tired of asking and begging over a 20-year period, and they decided to do a disparity study. And that's what that was that I showed you. They took the 1938 budget and they showed how 97.4%, 97.4 cents out of every dollar went to the white schools, and only 2.6 cents out of every dollar went to the colored schools.
Yeah.
And this was published right after World War II. And my grandmother was going to retire in 1945. But she decided to stay on because of her study, the Falls Church Colored School, a new school was built there. It was the first modern school for African Americans. And that was the James Lee Elementary School on Annandale Road. After that, a number of other schools were upgraded and rebuilt. Gum Springs, they put more money into the Vienna School, which is now Louise Archer. And I'm sure Sylvia did a book on Louise Archer. And so she knows very well that history. So that's how that study came about.
Thank you.
Now, Michelle, did you have a question too, you said?
Well, I actually had several questions, but we seem to have run out of time, and I know I can grab you another time. I might have to do another one of these and get my friends here to join us. But this has been fascinating. I have so many notes and like I said, quite a few questions. But I do want to honor people's times as we are a little bit over. President Camlin, do you have any parting words?
I'll be really brief. I want everybody to be able to have time to decompress and get ready for tomorrow, dawn of another day. But I just want to say that every time that I hear you speak, it opens my eye up as how deep the contribution of the Black community is here in Fairfax County and throughout the country, and how important it is for us to stay vigilant in making sure that the untold stories are told and the ones that have been told are corrected and conveyed accurately. And I know we're starting to see these pushback that's going on within our schools, trying to rewrite history. And the more we know when to stop those false truths from coming forward. So it's really important for us. And I think that Michelle and the Freedom Fund aptly named this session Remember Our Roots, because that is so important, because that's the foundation of our community and how we move forward. So again, I just want to say thank you. And the amount of historic resources you have is wonderful.
I'll say one thing about this whole CRT thing. If they hadn't created a false narrative to begin with, then there would be no need to correct it. What we're trying to do now is to correct the narrative, tell the truth. And if you're ashamed of what you did, if you think that what we're going to teach your kids will embarrass you, then that's unfortunate, because we're not doing anything but telling the truth. And if we had not created a false narrative in the first place, we wouldn't have to correct it. But now we have to.
Now we have to.
I would like to
Thank you,
ask
Michelle.
will this recording interview be accessible for us to look at later?
Yes, we will make sure that we send it out to us. If you registered,
Yes.
you will get the link to the recording. We'll make sure we get it
Wonderful.
sent it out.
There was so much historical information. I'd like
Yes.
to view it again. Thank
Yes,
you.
Absolutely. And we'll have to invite Mr. Henderson back for another
Anytime.
session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it.
Night, everyone. Thank you.
And someone posted a YouTube video where some of this history can be found. Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, it was with Creative Cauldron, and Ed and Tenor Hill helped put that production together.
Okay.
It's called Tenor Hill Portraits of Black and White. And it's amazing because it takes a lot of this history and brings it to life with a really nice theater production.
Oh, okay. I'll add that. I'll make sure that's in the email that gets sent with the link to tonight's recording. I'll make sure that's included. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.